According to the most recent surveillance data from CDC, hysterectomy is the second most frequently performed surgical procedure for women of reproductive age, topped only by cesarean delivery. The USA has the highest rate of hysterectomy in the industrial world, with 5.5 per thousand women undergoing the procedure each year. All women considering hysterectomy should be aware of these risks prior to surgery in order to make an informed decision as to whether the procedure is the best treatment option for you as a woman. Good evening. Welcome to another special edition of the Queen's Grapevine. This is your host, Wallingford Lee. Tonight on the International Grapevine, we're going to talk about hysterectomy. We want to touch on this sensitive matter that happens to certain women under certain circumstances. We think it's extremely important to educate our audience, and this is a great opportunity to talk about this. We have someone that is very capable of doing it, someone that we have worked with in the past for many, many years, and it took us a while to catch up with her. I'm talking about Dr. Carol McIntosh, who happens to be a OBGYN, a very qualified person that worked for various hospitals in New York City. Today, she happens to be the director of hospital services in Grenada. Prior to that, she works in Virginia. She also worked in New York with an excellent record. And more importantly, she has been on the grapevine talking on a couple of sensitive issues before, such as pap smear and how to carry yourself after pap smear. Well, tonight on the grapevine, we're going to talk about hysterectomy, and it gives us a great deal of pleasure, of course, to have her on our program. Welcome to our program, Dr. McIntosh.
Well, thank you. And it is a pleasure. It's true that we've gone back a long time, and to actually come back again, it's good. It is really good. And it is a pleasure. And I thank you for inviting me again to be on the show. Thank you.
Well, it's always good to work with you, especially on these type of things. I mean, you have done a tremendous job, and we love working with you. And a couple of people wrote back asking why we haven't done anything with you. And I says, well, here we are now. So maybe if you could take a little bit of time to tell our beautiful audience just exactly what is hysterectomy.
I'm sorry, just exactly?
Yeah, what is the interpretation of hysterectomy?
Okay. So before we start into what exactly hysterectomy is, you first want to know, well, what is it we're taking out? So hysterectomy means removal of the uterus. And so before we start, it's always good to know, well, what is the uterus? Where is it at? And then you start to understand the reasons that you start to remove them or why you need to remove them. So before I start to talk about the hysterectomy, I first want to just give an idea for anatomy. And I always used to tell women in general that we are wonderfully made. We are a beautiful body of Christ. And this is in the Bible. So I'm not just pulling this out. We are wonderfully made. And so now when we talk about the anatomy, everything that we know about the anatomy is made very clearly. And so the uterus, and when we go through the anatomy, and we just want to bring up the slide to just show it. It shows that go to the next slide. Before we start in, I just want to say I'm in Grenada, so I'm not necessarily in the United States, and this is just a little taste of Grenada Grandad's. And we go to the next slide and get to the diagram of the uterus. So here, the uterus is our internal organ. And you're looking at this now, and the uterus is the body or the womb or what carries a pregnancy. This is what it is, just talking about the uterus. So we have tubes and ovaries, if you continue with the slide, and we have the vagina. And that is what makes up the internal organs of a female, of a woman. The fallopian tubes, the ovaries, the uterus, the vagina, and the cervix. So the cervix is part of the uterus. We call that the mouth of the uterus. And remember I said the uterus is the womb. Basic portion or the function of the uterus is simply to carry a pregnancy. From the uterus, it prepares for that. And that's why every month, when you've reached into menarche or start having your periods, every month, if you're not pregnant, you break down the lining of the uterus. And that's when the blood comes out with tissue that was put up to prepare for pregnancy. So now you understand what the uterus does. When people talk about, oh, what makes me a woman? Where's the hormones? That doesn't come from the uterus. That comes from the ovaries. The estrogen and progesterone, which is what makes a woman, gives her the soft skin and the curves, etc. That comes from the ovaries, and those hormones work on the uterus. So now, if you look to your lower left corner, you will see how the uterus sits inside the body. So this is showing you there, and now you're seeing how it sits inside the body. So if you're standing up, that's how your uterus sits. Literally, the fallopian tubes are there, the ovaries are hanging with it, and the uterus is sitting inside. It is below the bladder, and it's above the rectum. So if you were taking a picture of yourself, or you stop and took a mirror and put it between your legs and look, and I recommend all of us do that, is that you would see where you urinate from, then the vaginal opening, and then you would see the rectum. Those three areas are very close to each other. And that's important as we talk about a hysterectomy. I want to go to the next slide and show this in real time, that shows what the uterus looks like in the abdomen in real life. So we go to the next one. So now you look at this again. This is taking a picture of a person inside their abdomen. We stuck a camera in and looking into the pelvis, and you're seeing this. So this is what a uterus looks like inside. And I want to make special note, this may seem a little strange, but I had one woman ask me this back when we were working in New York. We were doing a prostate clinic, and she would ask me, she says, does all women vagina look the same? And I said, the only thing that's different is our skin, the skin color. Otherwise, everything is exactly the same. So if you look, you couldn't tell, is this a black woman, white woman, Asian woman, Muslim? You can't tell when you go inside. All of us inside looks the same. And this is the uterus, the ovaries, and the tubes, just like I showed you. And you can see, if you look at the lower portion of that, that's bowel. That's fat on top of the bowel. The upper portion of the uterus, that's the bladder, is sitting there with the abdominal cavity. And then you're seeing other things that connect the uterus to hold it in place inside the abdomen. So this is the start. So now when you see this, and when we start talking about hysterectomy, and the Latin word for uterus is hystero, you know uterus, hysterectomy, removal of the uterus. Not tubes and ovaries, not your bladder, not your rectum, but just simply the uterus, which includes the cervix, or doesn't have to, because there's different types of removal. You can have just a normal hysterectomy, which is a total hysterectomy, remove the uterus and the cervix. You can have a supracervical hysterectomy, meaning that you use the body of the uterus alone. And when we talk about reasons for doing the hysterectomies, you'll understand why that's important and what it means in removal of just the uterus and leaving the cervix in place. And then you can talk about what's called a radical hysterectomy, meaning that you remove the uterus and everything that surrounds it. You go further out. So you also remove the tubes and ovaries. You also remove a portion of the vaginal vault of the vagina. You look to say, take some of the extra areas where you see broad ligament and round ligament, you take those. And that's usually done when a person has cancer, so that you make sure you remove every single area and to make sure that the cancer has not spread out. And if it has, then you're able to remove all of that. So that's a long way of saying what a hysterectomy is. I'm sorry.
No, but it's very educational and very to the point. I'm very impressed about it because, like I said, I read a lot about it, but I wasn't really aware of the involvement and what it takes. How many type of hysterectomy do we have on board in terms of that? Because I know there's different type of hysterectomy.
Okay, so the removal of the uterus, remember I told us those are three types of removing the uterus. But then how do you remove it? There's different ways to remove it. Okay, so there's the simple everyday way, abdominal hysterectomy, meaning you make a cut in the abdomen, you go in, it's a full operation, you open up and you remove the uterus. Then there's what's called the vaginal hysterectomy, where instead of opening up, you make no incision on the abdomen and you go through the vagina and remove the uterus through there. Then you also have what's called the laparoscopic assisted hysterectomy, meaning that you look in and with the camera, and as you're watching, you start doing removal of the uterus. You do use the instruments and you make what we call, is I call band-aid surgery, and you remove it. And how you get the uterus out is that you would make a slit in the vagina and take it out through there. So you have just small holes on the uterus, on the abdomen. Then you have what's called the laparoscopic assisted vaginal hysterectomy, meaning that you're doing a vaginal hysterectomy, but someone's looking from the top to make sure that you don't go into the extra organs. That usually happens if you have scar tissue, so you make sure you don't hit the bladder, etc. And then you have what's most recently that's come into play, and we call it Da Vinci, but it's called robotic hysterectomy, meaning, and this is very interesting. I could be sitting right here in front of my screen, and the person is in the operating theater, and I'm doing, I mean, I'm not usually not that far. I would be in another room per se. And literally, it's like a video game. You're sitting there and you're moving the instruments, removing the
Wow.
uterus. And that's what we call robotic, because no one's, I mean, people are in the operating theater because you need people to be right there. The anesthesiologist is right there, but you are sitting away from the person and making the slits, and the instruments are doing all the different work. So that's what's called robotic. You're not
But
acting the person's side.
in that robotic though, I imagine that they have a camera that goes into a part of
Yes.
the stomach of the lady, and they have the robotic part that is doing the job. And I think there's only 2 or 3 small incision in that type of surgery, to the best of my knowledge, maybe
Exactly.
4 incision. And I
Right.
understand it's a very successful surgery, doing it that way.
Yes.
What type of care after surgery of that magnitude is done? What type of care is required? And does the woman go home the same day, or it all depends on other things?
Exactly. So you can imagine. So let's go back to when you open up the abdomen. Okay, let's talk about the abdominal hysterectomy. You open up
Right.
the abdomen, you move the bowel, because remember, you see the bowel, you take down the bladder, and you do all these different things. So you move things around inside, and then you got to close up the abdomen. You have this large incision. Post operatively, after that surgery, yes, you try to feed the person quickly, but you might have to wait because she's gone to sleep, and you have to move the bowel, and the bowel may not be fully awake, and she may be a little nauseous. And then you have to wait for that incision. You don't want it moving around too much. You want it to move, but you have to be slow. Now I'm going to go all the way to robotic. You got 4 what they call little incisions. Again, it's called band-aid surgery. 4 incisions. You're doing the same thing with the robotic, with the instruments inside the abdomen without opening up the abdomen. So there's minimally invasive. That's what we call minimally invasive. The other one is full invasive because you're opening up. This one is minimally invasive. Because it's minimally invasive, you do very little. You don't really touch the bowel. You do very little. Should have lower blood loss. It's, again, if in the hands of an expert, it will have about the same amount of time as if you're doing an abdominal hysterectomy. And this person literally can go home after surgery. They may keep them a day, depending on how long it took, but they can go home after surgery. So
After
that's the
surgery.
2.
Okay.
And then you have
No,
the
go ahead.
vaginal hysterectomy, which back in the day was the one that was, we call that one, because you didn't open up the abdomen, you went through the vagina, you took out the uterus, you slowed it up, and you may put a packing in, and you kept the person 1 day. Once they're able to urinate, you're able to send them home. And the person doesn't have any incision that is outwardly seen because everything is done through the vagina. So that's another form, but we say minimally invasive. So again, the types of surgery, and you can do robotic, it depends on what's going on. Because we can start with saying, I'm going to do a laparoscopic vaginal hysterectomy for fibroids. But then when you look inside, you see person also has endometriosis, or they may have had a C-section, and so the uterus is stuck now to the bladder. Because remember, the bladder is on top, the rectum is below. Well, they say, oh shucks, if I try to remove this, I might get into the bladder. And if I get into the bladder, I have to repair that. So the person may decide, I'm going to switch from laparoscopic and I have to open up because I need better visualization. I need to make sure I'm moving things away. What I need to do in the sense of dissecting, may cause me to hit another piece of another organ, and I want to avoid that. So lessen the danger during the type of surgery. So sometimes you can switch in the middle of the type, or just as you're starting, you may say we're going to start with a laparoscopic and end up doing abdominal, or you do a
Because
robotic.
you found something different that forced you to do that.
Exactly. Or even while you're doing the robotic, perchance you're going along, and that has a higher risk because you're having like your electrical cautery or burning the vessels to make sure they don't bleed, or you putting a staple here. You're losing. Remember, it's like you're using the instruments there, so you have the scalpel, and it may be and this is a small risk. You might slip and have slit a vessel, and you start having bleeding. You have to go in because you're not going to be able to see where the vessel is bleeding because the blood is now welling up and you can't see. So you need to go in to be able to go. And so it may change, one, because you may need more visualization, two, because a complication has occurred and it's causing you to change.
Does this type of surgery cause any type of menopause in women?
Okay, excellent. No, a hysterectomy, and if we go back to anatomy, is the removal of the uterus and the cervix. And I can talk about why we do both of those. But as long as you leave the ovaries in place, that person doesn't go into menopause unless they're postmenopausal already, because it's the ovaries. Because when women say, "Oh my God, if you remove my uterus, then I'm not a woman anymore," and I'm being very straightforward because this is how people are going to talk. It's like, no, 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 no. Remove the uterus. Your ovaries are still there because what makes you a woman is the estrogen, the progesterone, and what that comes from is the hypothalamus sends down FSH or follicle stimulating hormones to the ovaries. The ovaries put out estrogen that prepares the uterus, and it also does other effects systematically. So you are not going into menopause if your ovaries are still in place and you're pre-menopausal. Now there are times
That's
when you have to remove the ovaries, and that's when you're saying you're putting a person into menopause.
in this type of hysterectomy. What type of women usually tend to have these issues? Is it an older person? What I mean by older, maybe 40 plus or 50 plus, or does it happen to younger women also?
So it depends. So now when we start, and let me stop and go through the slides and show the different types, and I can talk about that as we go through.
Okay.
So when we go past anatomy and start to show it, one of the reasons for hysterectomy, because the person has excessive bleeding, okay? And they can have excessive bleeding because of fibroids. That usually, if you go on to the next one, so remember, this is a normal uterus. A normal size of a uterus is the size of my fist, 8 centimeters. So if you look at that,
Okay.
that's a normal size of a uterus. This is a uterus. Remember, see that? And this next one
Mhm.
is live. Remember, and this is a uterus that has fibroids. Okay? And fibroids are an overgrowth of the muscle of the uterus. So you look at this and imagine this is big because you're seeing the little boxes of gauze, and that's not that small. This is about 20 centimeters, or I would say like maybe 40 inches. And you're seeing the big balls. There's on the top to so you see a larger one and a smaller one. And I would say it looks like bowling balls. We talk in food in gynecology. So we were saying this looks like the size of like a watermelon. Um, and you're seeing vessels, those blue and dark vessels, that's blood to this. So this has grown. Remember I said the size is the size of my fist. This has grown remarkably. And so the woman's abdomen is quite big. And then if it changes the inside surface of the uterus, they're going to bleed excessively. So it can cause bleeding. These are fibroids, they're not cancer, but it can grow, cause bleeding, cause pain, and cause your abdomen to just be large. Like you just look like you're constantly pregnant. And so you start to think about, it moves the other organs in the body, it moves them aside. It presses on the kidneys and kind of causes a little blockage. It can press on the bladder and make you go to the bathroom often. It can press on the rectum and make you constipated because stool can't get past that. So those were fibroids. This can occur, it usually is in women 40, 45 and older. As you get older, it increases in size. Younger women, it would not necessarily, it should not be that fast, because if it's growing that fast in a woman that's 20 something, we start to think malignancy. But this is where a reason for removal of the uterus. We go to the next slide.
Next slide,
Then
Julio.
we start to talk about other reasons for it. I'm going to just stop and saying women's cancer. This is where we start talking about, these are most of the times. Family history tells you that you need to look out for breast cancer, ovarian cancer, etc. Just wanted to let us be aware of why you need to be preventative care. Start to make sure you go to your gynecologist at the age of 21 and you go in regular. So you can start to pick up if there's fibroids growing, you might be able to remove them before they get that large, or be able to do things to help decrease it getting that large. But then if it's cancer, you want to get early. But there's different types of cancer. If we go to the next slide. And I don't want to gross people out, but keep going, keep going.
Next, Julio.
So you're looking at this. Again, this is the uterus, okay? And you're seeing what looks like two parts. And you're seeing on the left, that's the uterus itself. Those little white areas are fibroids, okay? That's the uterus that has grown in size. So the cervix is the lower portion, is what we actually started to cut. And then to the right, you're seeing this yellowish, black area with holes, etc. That's a cancer that has grown inside the uterus, okay? And it's part of the uterine wall. And that is the malignancy. That would be another reason for hysterectomy. And that can be, it can unfortunately be at any age. It would present itself in a postmenopausal woman with bleeding, because you're not, once you're postmenopausal, you have no more periods. But if you start having a growth, this could present. And so this would be a full hysterectomy, because you see the tubes and ovaries are also removed. And you know this person's postmenopausal because the ovary is very small. That's to the left, right smack in the middle of the uterus. And then you have this malignancy. So that whole thing was removed. And I would tell you how we know is because the woman talked about bleeding. She talked about bleeding after sex. She talked about, like I said, postmenopausal bleeding and pain and continuous bleeding. But then when we looked inside the vagina, what we saw was this tissue. We didn't see the cervix anymore. We saw this mass that was coming through the cervix, and took a biopsy of that, and they told us it was cancer.
That was the big sign of cancer, imagine, right there.
Yes. Yes, bleeding, pain. Now just remember, just talking about uterus, because we got all the other things. We got ovarian and others, but I'm going to focus on the uterus. If you have to say it, the uterine cancers you would know about because it starts bleeding immediately. That's the first sign. And it depends on the woman where she may say, oh, some women forget, they're like postmenopausal, they say, oh, it's my period again. And they start to have the bleeding and it continues. Or they have bleeding after sex, and that's the first one because the penis touches the cervix and it bleeds. And they would say, oh, that may happen. And they say, I'm just going to not pay attention to it. And it continues. So this is why you need to be aware of your body. And when something happens that is not normal, go in to just get checked. Because the earlier you can, that's the one thing with uterine cancer. The earlier you go in, because it shows up very early, it can be cured. And I want to talk about a particular type of cancer in the uterus that can be preventable, where they're now showing that if you're diabetic, overweight, postmenopausal, woman of color, you're at risk for endometrial cancer, your bread and butter. I'm going to talk about this one in a minute.
Okay.
And all of the different things you can manage, because if you're diabetic and you keep your sugars under control, that'll help. But the diabetes with the glucose going out and affecting our peripheral fat will cause more estrogen. You're postmenopausal, so you're not supposed to be putting out estrogen, and it'll start to affect the uterus. If you're obese, your body, and I'm in the obese, your body would make the fat, and the fat can generate a type of estrogen that affects the uterus. And then again, women of color, they're seeing that. And so we're at higher risk. And we are high risk because we would tend to have higher risk of developing diabetes, type 2 diabetes. We tend to be obese. And again, we can talk about the different reasons and always talk about the social determinants, because if you don't have a very healthy diet and you're not exercising or not able to because you got to work all these different times, then this is what's going to happen. But this is one of the things that can be prevented if you're able to say, let me watch. I'm postmenopausal. Let me try to keep a good diet. Let me exercise. Let me keep my weight down. If I'm going to be pre-diabetic, and we start to learn about that because you're going to the doctor regularly and you start to see, maybe I can change my diet around and see if I can avoid going into type 2 diabetes. So that's one where it's a cancer that can be cured because the first sign is bleeding and you can remove the uterus. That helps, and remove the ovaries. But to even get to the point of being preventable, that this is something that can be preventable, that if you do the other things to make sure that you stay healthy, you can possibly prevent getting endometrial cancer. And that's the cancer
So
of the
the
lining.
the key with cancer is always trying to get to it as quick as possible before it spread. Now, when you do a surgery
It's,
like that and you do the removal, can the cancer come back in some
so
cases?
it depends on the type of cancer. They have the whole thing. That's why we watch everyone for 5 years, right? After you do the uterus, remove the uterus. So if you remove the uterus, and you may do it, you remove the uterus, the tubes, the ovaries. You look at the pathology, and it says the cancer was contained. It was contained inside the uterus. So it was stage 1B. So it didn't go outside of the uterus. It was like maybe the uterus and the cervix. If you remove that, then there's a high probability that you're cured, that it's not going to come back. But
Okay.
if it's like the other cancer that I showed, that one, and then the one that they were showing again, these are much more, it's a different type of cancer. It's a malignant mullerian where it's very poorly developed, a type of cancer. That one, even as you remove it, you will still need to give chemotherapy to make sure you get some of those cells because it can recur. So it depends, really depends on the type of cancer, the stage at the time that you're treating it to determine if you're going to have it recur.
Let's talk a little bit about the healing process of any one of these hysterectomy. What is the healing process for a woman after surgery? I read sometime it's 3 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, because we cover a lot of things, and which is very good. But what is the healing process in terms of whether you stay in a hospital for 1 day, 2 days, and when you get home, what is the process to take care of yourself and what have you?
Mhm. So it depends on the type of hysterectomy that's done. So we talk about the laparoscopic and the robotic and the vaginal hysterectomy. Those are what we call like somewhat minimally invasive. You're not going to be in the hospital
Right.
for a long period of time. So you're able to go home. And say within about 2 weeks, then you can say that you're back to the way you were previous to the surgery. And so you can move around. You can move around immediately. We tell people after the surgery, you're up and about, but you're urinating fine, you're eating fine. Yes, you're good. Now we give people extra time when we start to cut open the abdomen because it takes up to about 4 to 6 weeks for the repairing of the suturing of the abdomen to have it stay closed. And that's one, if you actually open up the abdomen to remove the uterus, then you start to say 4 to 6 weeks. You may be in the hospital up to a week, but again, it's only up until you're eating fine, you're urinating fine, you've had a bowel movement, and even that just passing gas, you can go home. We tell you not to lift any heavy objects because you have sutures that are now bringing this incision back together, and the muscles are now back together. But if you if you lift something heavy, you start to use your abdominal muscles, and you may separate something. So that's why we say you take it slow and gradually go to that point. But you don't lay in bed. We're far from that of laying in bed and don't move around. You move around, but you take it slow. And I tell people at 6 weeks, you're back to the way you were before surgery. You can do your exercise, but I mean, if you were running like a marathon, you don't start back up to that. You work yourself back up to that one. But you can start all of those exercising, do all those different things fully. We stop again now with the going inside the vagina. If you do a vaginal hysterectomy, if you do a laparoscopic because they take out the uterus through the vagina, we tell you nothing in the vagina because you want that to heal because the vagina connects you back into the abdomen. So you don't want to put anything inside there because that can get inside the abdomen and can cause infection. So we would say to a woman, no sex, no tampons, nothing inside the vagina, no baths, just take showers so that nothing settles in the vaginal vault and allows for that to heal. And you may see, which is good because you may see a little bit of blood. That's what's coming out, some liquid, etc. But if you see excessive blood, you know that this is a sign I need to go back to the doctor. Then let's
After
talk
surgery, in
about
a situation like that, when can they have sex? How long after can a woman have sex?
So after, we would tell them after one that's with the 6 weeks for not to lift anything, and we say 6 weeks for no sex. If you had like a vaginal hysterectomy, we say 4 weeks. Okay. And we give women more time sometimes because they'll say, well, if you're telling me 4
Sure.
weeks, my husband's saying, I understand that. We'll tell you 6 weeks and hopefully you'll get to 4 weeks. We really try to push that. And we tell them to wait. But then we have people that have a super cervical hysterectomy. And if you go back to the anatomy, the picture, just a diagram, it would show the uterus and the cervix. The cervix is where we do the pap smears, etc. And there are times if you just have fibroids in the body of the uterus and you leave the cervix, because some women will say, oh my gosh, if you remove the cervix, then what happens to my vagina? I can't have sex, etc. And they talk about the G spot or what makes me, gives me pleasure after sex. As a gynecologist said, a G spot is in the mind. But people do say, I would like to keep the cervix in place. And you can see that portion on what that does, it helps to keep the vagina, the vaginal length of the vault in place. It also helps to keep from prolapse. It can prolapse, but it helps to hold it in place because the ligaments are there. And then the cervix being in place, there's no connection per se back up inside the abdomen. And people say that they're able to have sex. Their pleasure is still the same. So that's something that you talk with your doctor about. If the reason that you're having the hysterectomy does not involve the cervix, meaning that you did not have cervical cancer, there's no cancer that's present, you did not have abnormal pap smears, then more than likely you can keep the cervix in place and just remove the body of the uterus because your purpose is to remove the fibroids and get rid of the bleeding.
Well, doctor, let me just say this. Unfortunately, time have grabbed us, but I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the family of the Grapevine, and I'm very serious about this, to have a second interview with you. I swear, this is great information. It's great for the community, especially or Latinos that go through this process. We don't have words to thank you today for all information that you have imparted to us. Very educational and very important for ladies, mothers, sisters, grandmothers. And again, promise us that you'll come back for a part 2, please.
Oh, I would love to because we just talked about the uterus and, we are wonderfully made. That's in Psalm 139. And I'm saying this and people say, why are you saying? Because, and it's quoted in the Quran. It's also in the Torah. It's there. We are wonderfully made. And the one thing that's going to keep you healthy is knowing your body. Your body is a temple. So you want to keep it well. And so the only way you can keep it well is to know what is it that I'm trying to keep well. And that's by education. And that gives you power to do that. So I would love to come back and talk about it. I think our body is absolutely beautiful. Every woman should just take off all their clothes, not in public, in the mirror, and look at yourself and say, shoot, I'm the best thing since sliced bread. I am wonderfully made. And when you think of yourself and love yourself and understand the beauty of yourself, you will then keep yourself healthy. Guaranteed. So I would love to come back and talk about it.
But we're going to hold you to that. We want you back in the Grapevine. I really mean that. Once we get off, we'll talk about a part 2, please.
Okay, perfect. No problem. Very good. Thank you very much for having me.
Anytime. This is Wallingford Lee saying good night for the Queen's Grapevine, and we hope that this program has been to your liking and, more importantly, educational. because Dr. McIntosh touched on a lot of extremely important part. And again, one of the key components for a woman is knowing our body, know when to go to a doctor, know the feelings that you're feeling in your body that require the medical help. And again, thanks for watching our program. And this is Wallen Furley saying good night for the International Grapevine. Thank you.